Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who's joining us online for this session at the Singapore Fintech Festival as part of the Apex Oxygen sessions. We are really excited to have a number of panelists with us today to talk about the future vision of open finance. As I'm sure many of you are aware, joining this session here at the Singapore Fintech Festival, open banking and versions of it are rapidly being developed across the globe, from Japan to Australia, from the Philippines to Peru. Many jurisdictions are now putting together legislative frameworks, and industry members and associations are also playing an important role in shaping the open data economy and financial services sector. To discuss some of the issues, how this is working, what people have in terms of a vision, and some of the plumbing issues behind the scenes of this new part of the financial architecture, we've invited four very important speakers from different markets across the globe to share their perspectives on how this is evolving and how some of this is working, or maybe not working, as the case may be. So I'd like to very briefly introduce to you the panelists we have with us today. First of all, starting in the East, you might say, I'd like to welcome Melkor Plabasan, who is Director of Technology, Risk, Innovation and Supervision Department at the Central Bank in the Philippines, the BSP. Secondly, moving a little bit further to the West, I'd like to welcome Dr. Chaiwat Satawarnwichit, who is an advisor at the BIS Innovation Hub in Hong Kong, on secondment there from the Central Bank of Thailand. Thirdly, moving a little bit further towards the West, I'd like to welcome B.G. Mahesh, who is the CEO and co-founder of Digital Sahamati, an association in India about which he'll tell you more, playing a key role in the account aggregator space. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Mr. John Broxis, who joins us from Paris. He is the Chief Executive and Managing Director of Open Banking Europe, the role of which in the open banking environment in Europe he will explain a little bit more as the panel progresses. So that's by way of our short introduction. I'd like to then, without further ado, move on to the topic of our debate. And I would like to welcome, first of all, Mel in the Philippines to share with the audience some of the insights and ambitions and motivations that have come into their development of an open banking regime, which is still really at an early stage of development, but also to share with us what some of the challenges are, the practical challenges that you anticipate or are already facing as you roll out this first phase of open banking in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. I hope you can hear me. I'm having trouble with my internet. Anyway, as you clearly pointed out, open banking, we see open banking as a potential game changer in the Philippines. You know, in particular, we are cognizant of the benefits of moving towards an open banking ecosystem, which espouses consent-driven data portability, interoperability, and collaboration among traditional financial institutions and fintech players. So we believe that the game-changing impact of open banking is really on the permission access to financial information, which is critical in order to develop innovative services and solutions which will allow for greater financial transparency options among the clients. So that said, open banking really is a critical component of our digital payment transformation roadmap. And in fact, as you pointed out, I have already reviewed the final draft, and we hope to upload in our website for comments of the industry within this week. And in terms of the challenges, I think we see buy-in as a potential challenge because similar to what was experienced in other jurisdictions. Some players, particularly the traditional and the big ones, would have that fear of their clients being stolen by new players. So that the buy-in we have to really uh, work on addressing the issue of buy-in. I think uh, and another is the level of automation or digital transformation among the different players in the Philippines. So I think given the varying technology profile, I think it would take a while before the smaller institutions can be onboarded given the limitations, let's say, in technology resources or technology skills. That's all, Ivan.
Just a quick follow-up question then, Mail. Yeah, as this is happening in the digital world increasingly, where, like today, we have difficulties maybe accessing these new services, understanding how to trust them. What is your vision, and what are some of the challenges you see with enabling new actors to play a role in this digital environment?
I missed the last question.
What are the challenges and risks you anticipate in enabling new actors to come into the financial sector and access and use this data?
Yeah.
How do you protect the market?
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, having, let's say, the regulation that, and of course the standards will help ensure that both the traditional and the new players will, I mean, in terms of the market conduct of these players, to ensure that they'll be, I mean, and I think in the Philippines, I think connectivity is also an issue. I know it's also an issue in other jurisdictions. So, for it to be impactful and so that it can be enjoyed by most of our citizens, we also need to address some issues related to national ID, related to internet connectivity. This will all help in transitioning smoothly to an open banking ecosystem.
Thank you, Mail. Okay, so this is an interesting starting point. I'd like to now maybe switch all the way over to the other side to John in the European Union, where at least elements of open finance have been put in place a little bit earlier, and ask him maybe he could share some of the experience to date on what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, to explain his organization's role in this kind of environment, and maybe say a few words about what the role of policymakers and regulators are, what could have been done better and what worked out well.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. So I think the first thing to say is that in Europe, there's been a huge regulatory push to get open banking and then open finance moving. This was discussed probably 7 years ago for the first time. There was a whole run-up that finally went live 1 year ago, September 2019, where there was a law that said that every single bank had to open their accounts, give access to their accounts to third-party players who could then come and use APIs to get data and to make payments. So I think the first thing that's been really helpful is that the regulators have sent a very clear signal and in fact mandated that open banking happen and made sure that the vision is clear, that the open banking that they describe is really just the first steps, and really they want to see lots of exciting, innovative products built on top of this under the heading open finance. So very strong regulatory push. Unfortunately, in some ways, the way it was done has caused problems as well as providing solutions. The regulators in many cases haven't fully understood all the technical details that go behind, and nor should they, being regulators, but they found it very difficult to legislate in such a way that is precise enough to create requirements that banks can follow, but at the same time try to remain technology free. And in sitting between the two, they have underestimated some of the challenges and left large areas of uncertainty, which causes fragmentation, different interpretations, confusion, and really quite a hard process of implementing open banking bank to bank to bank to bank to bank across 4,000 different banks of the ecosystem. Now, this is a journey. These are things that can be fixed. And so it's been very important that organizations such as ours, Open Banking Europe, have come into place where the techs have got together to say, well, for this to work, we have to work together. And they have provided certain pieces of infrastructure, plumbing, as Ivan's just called it, to make this work. I think one of the key challenges, and again, the word has already been used just now from the Philippines, is identity. One of the first challenges that the identity of the players was not always clear, and it's absolutely important that there's a central directory of actors, of players who are allowed to play, and this is something that is now in place in Europe. And behind that, identity management, an authentication management system where Europe was able to rely on a fairly recent eIDAS legislation piece, which is all around electronic identity and certificates. So quite a lot of very new technologies, new ideas were coming into play for the first time, and it has been a challenge. But I would underline the absolutely key and fundamental point is you need a place where people can discuss and create the common and shared elements of the plumbing which are needed. It's not enough just to put an API somewhere on the internet and hope that it works.
Great, that's very interesting, John. So, I picked up a couple of points there that I think it would be interesting to reflect on with Chaiwat. You mentioned that the regulators kind of underestimated the complexity of the technology while still trying to take a technology neutral approach. And you mentioned the importance of collaboration within the industry. And lastly, also having ways to identify and verify the legal nature and integrity of some of the actors. I think these are all areas where in Thailand, there's been already some progress towards developing these parts of the ecosystem. And I was hoping, Chaiwat, that from your perspective at the BIS now, you could share a little bit with the audience how different, if at all, these challenges have been and how you approach them there.
Yes, thanks, Ivan. So for open banking framework in Thailand, the policymaker is preparing the financial landscape for open banking to empower the use of consumer data and at the same time to minimize any impact on the stability of the financial system. And we do so by taking a market-driven approach by piloting this project on a use case that share deposit account transaction information. So, and if we go a bit more general on this, the component of open banking ecosystem, in my view, can be consist of three important areas. The generation of consumer data, the consumption of consumer data, and the connection of consumer data. And I think policymakers should focus on the connection of data. That is to answer how to govern the movement of data from one service provider to another. And this can be done in many different ways. For example, we can connect service providers via a set of standardized API, or we can connecting them through a common infrastructure. And both have pros and cons. And it can be efficient and effective on some specific use cases, but maybe not for another ones. So there is no always right solution. And as John said, there are a lot of technical challenges behind this as we try to connect system of service providers. There can be, a lot of complexities under technologies, and as a regulator or policymaker, they have to be technology neutral, but at the same time, they have to be detailed enough to make the standard or make the specification to be concrete enough to be efficiently adopted.
Thank you, Jaiwat. There's some interesting aspects. I was hoping also you might briefly tell us, we've heard a lot in the international community about the role of the NDID. And before moving on to Mahesh, you could just give us a few ideas of how other government agencies are playing a role in Thailand.
Yes. As previously said by Mel and John as well, everything digital have to start from digital identity. If you want to open a bank account or subscribe for a loan or to any financial services digitally without going to branches, you have to start with identity, who you are. Your service providers have to trust your identity, and that is the starting point. So to answer your question about the National Digital ID in Thailand, or we call it NDID, it is an identity infrastructure that we have in Thailand, and it is designed to do the identity and authentication service. So with NDID, you can open a bank account digitally by using your mobile phone or some digital channel without going to any branches. If you have your digital identity verified by a trusted identity provider, this is the main and the important role of the NDID. But as we set up NDID here, it has extensive network of connections that can cover most of financial service providers. So it is very efficient and very effective to leverage this network capability as an infrastructure for the connection of data as well. So we are now piloting the use of NDID as a common infrastructure for data connection among financial service provider, and that this is the use case that I mentioned previously, the deposit account transaction information sharing, and this is we need infrastructure like this to support digital financial service. And I can tell you that NDID has its starting point from the banking sector, but it is now owned and shared among industry in many sectors, like telcos, insurance, security brokers as well.
Okay, interesting. That's very interesting. So that's a good point at which to turn over to Mahesh in Bangalore. Maybe Mahesh would be interested to hear a little bit more about the role of your industry association.
Sure.
In the way that we've heard in some other markets, industry initiatives seem to be increasingly important in this broader open finance trend. So please let us have a little insight into the Indian market, which I think we all realize is also quite sophisticated.
Yes. So, thank you, everyone. So, the account aggregator is the new public digital infrastructure, which has appeared in India. and what we actually, it is known as the last layer of the India stack. So for all those who are not very familiar with India stack, I would encourage you to look into indiastack.org. I mean, it has a wealth of information, which I think you all can, actually see into. So the account aggregator is the consent layer of the India stack. The Central Bank of India, which is the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, actually, published the technical standards, the APIs and the schemas, in the year 2016, and about 1 year ago, they came up with the second version of it. Samati is, somewhat like a trade body. It is a collective for this account aggregator ecosystem. So in any such ecosystem, you have a lot of players. It is not only the banks. Okay, so, you have the banks. And in our case, I should emphasize that it is not only the banking data which is flowing through the account aggregator. I mean, we have the investment data, the insurance data, the pension fund. And as we go forward, we would like to see our income tax, and say telecom data. I mean, all that we hope one day will be the providers in this ecosystem. So now here we need to work with the ecosystem to see how we can improve this ecosystem, which will help ultimately the end consumer, because the actual goal of account aggregator is to increase the your financial inclusion. We want to ensure that an end user is able to use their own data, okay, to economically gain. So what we have been doing for the last year and a half is to work with the banks, to work with the government, your regulators, your technology service providers, the legal community, because they need to know what this is about, by which they're able to advise their clients, which will use the account aggregator. So we work, in all these areas actually. And say, if any of you are about to undergo the same journey, I wish there was one change which, we had done. As you know, in every bank, you do have your core banking service provider. I mean, the main software, where all your information is there. So in India, you have about 3-4 large CBS players. So I wish we had involved them from the very first day. Okay, because after all the information which we are sharing is from the CBS. Right. So if we had included them, I think the entire journey would have been more smooth, because for them it is a matter of introducing one more module to be able to share the data. So yeah, that's my input and the learnings which we have from India. And one other goal we have in Samati is to ensure we are very inclusive. So we work with people of all sizes, and we need to take care of the small players actually a lot.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Mahesh. Yeah, I mean, it brings up a couple of other questions I think I'd like you to kind of broadly as a group address. The first one is that, as you rightly pointed out, Mahesh, it's not just actually the small players within a market, and that, of course, is an important issue, which particularly at the World Bank we're concerned with, but also the smaller countries, many of which are now looking towards the EU and to India and now to the Philippines to see how it was done. So I have a kind of two-part question I'd like you all to kind of maybe chime in on. One is, what do timelines look like in implementing open banking? What are realistic ambitions to have, and what are some of the prerequisites for getting through the stages of regulation and motivating the market, as Mel was saying? And two, where where do big countries and small countries fit into this emerging ecosystem, which I guess is not going to be just domestic, but also international? So those are kind of linked questions. Maybe I can put it out to who wants to start first?
I'll start just because, because you asked, how soon will we go live and how exactly would you determine, can an entity go live on a new public infrastructure? So now what you have seen in India is the regulator has defined the standards. So actually Samati has come up with a certification framework, where we are able to check if each entity has implemented those APIs and the schemas, including the encryption, everything according to what was like in the specification. So once they are certified, they are able to go live. So I'm also happy to say that already about 4 banks and 4 account aggregators have been certified in India just about 15 days ago. So sometime in December you will see that they will be going live.
Just to clarify, then you mean that Sahamati as an industry organization is certifying some of the actors?
So actually, we have defined the framework on how it should be certified. So any of the third-party certifiers who are able to actually do that, they look at our framework and actually, they certify these entities that they have implemented according to the standard.
Okay, very interesting. So third-party certifiers, but using your framework as an industry. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. John, maybe we could switch back to you. I'd like you to kind of address the same questions from your experience.
Yeah, sure. And we have in Europe, we can make a comparison because we have 2 different implementations of open banking, one in the UK and one in Europe. And in fact, the UK regulators put an open banking framework into place about 1.5 years before the European regulation came in. The UK one was meant to be compatible with the European one, but still there were 2 different approaches. And in the UK, the regulator said, I'm going to focus on the 9 biggest banks, which between them cover 90% of the population. And I'm going to make the banks fund a central organization that will define specifications and make this work. In the European side, the regulator simply published some what they called regulatory technical standards and said, okay, there's 4,000 banks, off you go, follow this. With no real concept of certification or how it would be proved that somebody was following the rules or not, just the regulator saying you must do it. The UK implementation is much more consolidated, much more similar. I think we see a lot more fragmentation in Europe. Again, this is 9 banks versus 4,000. So now I'm not going to say the UK is a small country, but it is a much more condensed country, and therefore it does show that smaller ecosystems have some advantages. The other thing I would say that in both cases, UK particularly, UK went live in January 2018, so nearly 3 years ago. They went live 3 years ago on paper. I mean, they claimed to go live. They actually ran about 1.5 years late before they were sort of properly live. And then it's taken another 1.5 years before you really get consumers being offered something that they can use. So the live date is actually the starting date for then those who are going to access and use that consolidated data to get going. And it might take them 1.5 years to get things into the market as well. So it is a journey. Things don't happen fast. It's not a central system that you impose and everyone connects and it works on day one. It's much more modular than that. But that's certainly what we saw in Europe.
Thanks, John. I'd like to bring it back to you, Mail, on this question about the prerequisites and timing. But I'd also like you to pick up on one element of John, which is there he spoke particularly about consumers. And I was wondering in the Philippines to what extent this also applies to SMEs.
Yeah. So as in terms of its application, we see the potential benefit of open banking not only for consumers but small businesses as well, SMEs. And there are a lot of programs right now to empower SMEs, to digitize them, to capacitize them. So hopefully this open banking system would also provide assistance. I mean, would also enable our SMEs, because I think 90% of enterprises in the Philippines are MSMEs. So I think their role is very crucial, particularly in our economic recovery. So we'll make sure that the open banking ecosystem will benefit both the consumers and the MSMEs.
Thanks, Mayo. Chaiwa, what's your perspective on this issue of how long it takes to get the market going, and what phases you'll go through? And also, I'm curious, maybe you could also, given that Thailand is an integral part here in the region of some of the ASEAN level discussions, whether you see this as a domestic journey or a regional journey, maybe you, particularly when you look at it now from the perspective of the BIS, where do you see the international tendencies going for open finance?
Okay, so I think each country or each jurisdiction has its own problem and pains that policies have to try to solve. So one approach that works for one jurisdiction may not work for others. So like Thailand, we see frictions and cost of switching as a some of the problem and pain point that we think the more open finance will help consumers to receive better service. So the approach that we try to explore is that we pilot first, because we have to learn also the impact of what really happened after we implement some open finance policy, and by then we have to think carefully about the governance structure of the maybe organization or industry regulation that will come to govern the rules of open banking or open finance. And this is a journey for each jurisdiction or country, and I think it will not be a short journey, right? For Thailand, maybe we will go live our pilot somewhere between the first quarter or the first half of next year. But after that, we have to learn from the pilot, and we have to design the appropriate governing structure after that, because this is a very long-term project. So this is for each for only one jurisdiction. But if we see the region or the international movement, I think the trend likely push us to be more open across jurisdictions. Anyway, that require a lot of collaborations, not only among the regulators in each jurisdiction in ASEAN, but also the important players like major banks and major banking associations have to collaborate closely. So I think it will be a long journey.
Thank you, Chaiwa. That's actually a good segue into one of the other areas that our audience wanted to ask about, which is, where does finance data stop and where does the rest of the data ecosystem start? A lot of this debate we're having at the moment is amongst, as you say, banks, financial services authorities and regulators and central banks, and of course, fintech. But meanwhile, we have a growing, I would say, accelerating debate about how we manage access to and ownership of data outside the financial ecosystem. As many of you know, in some jurisdictions, I'll note Australia in particular, their approach to this problem has not been through the financial services regulator, but more taking a broader approach to consumer data rights. So I'd like to, in that context, go back to each of you quickly, just in the time that's left over, and ask you broadly, if in 5 years' time, in this area of managing data ownership, access right, usage, is this going to be more an economy-wide issue, in your view, or is it going to be finance on the one hand and the big techs on the other? Maybe you could just quickly give us an idea where you think we'll be on that point in 5 years' time. Shaivat, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so I think this is an industry-wide issue which may straddle across a lot of industry. Like you can get healthcare, you can get data from your healthcare service and be consumed in your financial services. Like if they see you got a large bill in your hospital expense, they may offer you some loans for that, for example. Yeah. So the trend, we have to look at the data around consumer as a whole. And once you consume one data, you generate a new one. And that one have to be stored somewhere and will be consumed again by someone else. So you need a good design of the connection to make this data to be flow and to be flow freely, to be flow securely, and to be the benefit of the consumer who owns the data.
Okay. Mesh, what do you think? In India in particular, is this going to be about open finance data or first and the rest of the data second, or is this open data first and then finance?
No, so I think in India it is starting off, with finance, but you will see that already the work in the health stack has already started in India. It has already started. So you will see even say by example June of 2021, the kinds of data which you will see which will flow through the account aggregators, it will be very, very varied. Okay, it will be very, very varied, and it will be so rich that according to us, the end consumer will actually gain a lot, which, for many of the services which he could not get until now, he or she, not to be precise, in future, because the access to the data, they will actually benefit a lot.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. And John, what about in Europe? Recently the EU came out with an overarching data strategy discussion document, I think. Very briefly, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I think 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we had a telecoms minister, we had a television minister, and then the internet came along. And now, of course, we don't think of these three things as three different things. We just think of telecommunications, which brings together, internet, TV. There's no difference between these streaming and data services. In the same way, I think that open finance, open health, open energy will be subsumed into something that is much more data driven. Certainly the EU has made steps with its GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, that came out, and is very afraid of particularly, I think, US organizations coming in and understanding that at a European policy level, it wants its own champions that can consolidate and hold data. So I think open data is clearly something that is being looked at from an information security point of view and a policy point of view.
Thanks, John. So, Mail, it sounds like you've got also a long journey in front of you. What's happening? You think what's going to happen in the next few years in the Philippines on that?
Yeah, I think open banking or open finance is premised, let's say, on the idea that customers own their financial data, transaction data, and they can share those. If they wish to share those data, they can share those data. So I think my view is that as long as there's an open API ecosystem, I mean, as long as there's an environment that wherein you can safely and securely share your information, I think I'm okay with expanding it beyond finance. So yeah, and I think that's also where regulations, conventions, standards, and rules will play a critical role.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I think we've now just reached our time limit. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their participation and a very interesting discussion. And I guess I can ask the audience for a virtual round of applause. I'm not sure if you'll all be able to hear it, but thank you very much, everybody. And I hope you enjoy the other sessions today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.